Two police officers, Sergeant Dave Fisher and Officer Karen Mitchell, were patrolling the streets of a quiet, upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. They were seasoned officers, both of them known for being tough but also for their reputation of having a questionable approach when it came to policing certain communities. Both had seen their fair share of complaints over the years, but they had managed to avoid serious consequences, protected by the code of silence and a system that often turned a blind eye. Before we get deeper into the story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Please comment below. It was a late afternoon when Fisher and Mitchell received a call about a suspicious vehicle parked outside a house. According to the caller, two black men had been sitting in a black SUV for nearly half an hour. Without further details, Fisher scoffed, exchanging a knowing glance with Mitchell. "Looks like we've got ourselves another case of trouble where it doesn't belong," Fisher muttered as they sped toward the scene. As they pulled up to the location, Fisher and Mitchell saw the two men in question still seated in the SUV. Immediately, the racial bias that had shaped so many of their previous encounters kicked in. They didn't bother checking the plates or calmly investigating. Instead, the pair stepped out of the squad car with a confrontational swagger, hands on their holstered weapons. "Step out of the car! Hands where we can see them!" Fisher barked, his tone more aggressive than the situation demanded. The two men inside the SUV exchanged a glance, calmly stepping out of the vehicle, their hands visible as requested. They were both dressed in casual but professional attire, button-down shirts and slacks. Their faces were composed, but the subtle tension between the two parties was unmistakable. "Is there a problem, officers?" one of the men asked calmly, his voice steady. He had a tall, commanding presence, his demeanor suggesting he was not unfamiliar with such encounters. "License and registration," Mitchell demanded, ignoring his question. She eyed them with suspicion, already framing them in her mind as criminals. "Of course," the second man said, reaching into his jacket slowly. Both Fisher and Mitchell tensed up as though preparing for some inevitable resistance. When the man withdrew his wallet, he opened it, revealing not a driver's license but a gleaming badge, the unmistakable shield of the FBI. Both Fisher and Mitchell froze. The first man followed suit, pulling out his own badge and holding it up. "Special Agent Marcus Carter, FBI," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This is Special Agent Darnell Walker. We're on assignment." A cold silence settled over the scene. Fisher blinked, caught off guard but unwilling to let go of his arrogance. "FBI, huh? That doesn't give you the right to loiter in this neighborhood. What kind of assignment are you on?" "That's classified," Carter said, his voice dropping a degree. "But rest assured, your actions are not going unnoticed." Mitchell, still clinging to the remnants of her authority, stepped forward. "Classified or not, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. We'll need to take you both in for questioning." She reached for her handcuffs, ignoring the warning glare from Carter. "That would be a mistake," Walker said sharply. "We're federal agents, and you're already way out of line. Don't make this worse than it already is." But Fisher, driven by his deeply ingrained prejudices and a sense of superiority, ignored the warning. He lunged forward, twisting Carter's arm behind his back and slapping the handcuffs on him. Mitchell did the same to Walker, though the agents barely resisted, their faces filled with simmering anger rather than fear. As they were hauled into the back of the squad car, Fisher smirked. "Looks like even FBI agents aren't above the law." Back at the precinct, things took a swift and unexpected turn. No sooner had Fisher and Mitchell brought the agents inside when the station chief, Captain Reynolds, appeared, summoned by a flurry of urgent phone calls. He strode into the booking area, his face a mix of confusion and shock. "What the hell is going on here?" Reynolds barked. "Just two suspects we picked up," Fisher said smugly. "Turns out they're FBI agents, but we figured we'd bring them in for questioning. Seemed a little out of place if you ask me." Reynolds' face turned pale as he eyed the two handcuffed agents. He knew the names Carter and Walker. They weren't just any agents. They were part of a specialized task force with direct connections to the Bureau's higher-ups. Worse still, this was an assignment that had been coordinated with local law enforcement, though it appeared the message hadn't trickled down to Fisher and Mitchell. "You've made a serious mistake," Reynolds muttered under his breath. He turned to the officers. "Get those cuffs off them, now!" "But Captain," Fisher started, confused by the sudden change in tone. "Now!" Reynolds snapped, his voice ice cold. The cuffs were removed immediately, and both agents stood up, fixing their crumpled shirts and glaring at the two officers with contempt. "We'll be filing a formal report on this," Carter said, his voice deadly calm. "You two just violated federal law by unlawfully detaining FBI agents. This will go straight to Internal Affairs and your precinct's oversight." Fisher's smirk was long gone, replaced by a sickly pale expression. He opened his mouth to protest, but Reynolds silenced him with a raised hand. "Do not say another word, Fisher." Carter stepped forward, staring Fisher and Mitchell down. "We deal with organized crime, terrorism, and people far more dangerous than you two could ever imagine. But what you just did, that was personal. You didn't care who we were. You saw two black men in an affluent neighborhood, and you made assumptions. That's going to cost you." Walker nodded in agreement. "We'll be sure to mention in our report the racial profiling, the unlawful arrest, and the excessive force." Fisher's heart sank as the weight of his actions began to crash over him. He had always felt untouchable behind the badge, but now he could see the career-ending consequences looming. Captain Reynolds, seething with anger at the recklessness of his officers, shook his head. "You two are suspended, effective immediately. Hand over your badges and guns." Fisher and Mitchell stood in stunned silence as they complied, their careers hanging by a thread. As the FBI agents left the precinct, Carter turned back one last time. "Next time, don't assume you know who you're dealing with just because of the color of their skin. It might save you from a mistake like this." Fisher and Mitchell watched in silence as the agents walked out, knowing full well that their days as officers were numbered. Payback had come swift and hard, and it was only the beginning. As the door swung shut behind Special Agents Carter and Walker, an oppressive silence filled the precinct. Fisher and Mitchell stood frozen, their badges and guns sitting on the desk in front of them like symbols of their ruined careers. Captain Reynolds, still simmering with fury, dismissed them with a single look. "Go home," he spat, his voice tight with anger, "and pray that Internal Affairs goes easy on you. But after this, I doubt either of you will be wearing a badge again." The weight of Reynolds's words sank in immediately. Fisher's mouth went dry and Mitchell's face turned pale. Without another word, they turned and left the precinct, walking into a future that looked more uncertain than ever. The news of the incident spread through the ranks of the police department like wildfire. Word quickly reached the higher-ups at both the Chicago PD and the FBI. Within days, Internal Affairs had launched a full-scale investigation into Fisher and Mitchell's actions, focusing not just on the arrest of the FBI agents, but also on their history with racial profiling and excessive force complaints. For years they had skated by, avoiding serious punishment due to the culture of silence within their department. But this time, there was no escape. While the investigation unfolded, Fisher and Mitchell were placed on unpaid leave with their careers in limbo. They quickly found that the fallout wasn't limited to their jobs. The local media caught wind of the story, and soon it became a national headline. Police officers arrest black FBI agents in shocking case of racial profiling. Asterisk. The backlash was immediate, with civil rights groups calling for the officers' permanent dismissal and the implementation of stronger measures to root out systemic racism within the police force. At the same time, Carter and Walker returned to their work at the FBI. Despite the personal nature of the incident, they remained focused on their mission, an undercover investigation into organized crime that had brought them to that neighborhood in the first place. But behind closed doors, they were working to ensure that Fisher and Mitchell faced consequences for their actions. "We need to push this," Walker said during a meeting with the FBI's legal team. "This isn't just about what happened to us. This is about sending a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not by local law enforcement, and certainly not by anyone wearing a badge." The FBI's leadership agreed. Their legal team worked closely with the Department of Justice to make sure that the case against Fisher and Mitchell was airtight. They reviewed body camera footage, took statements from witnesses, and gathered evidence from past complaints against the two officers. What emerged was a damning picture of two cops who had operated with impunity for far too long. Meanwhile, Fisher and Mitchell found themselves isolated. Their fellow officers, who had once backed them without question, began to distance themselves as the investigation deepened. The so-called blue wall of silence had crumbled under the weight of the evidence piling up against them. Fisher's anger grew with each passing day, but there was nothing he could do but wait for the inevitable. "You believe this?" he ranted one night, pacing around his dimly lit apartment. "We were just doing our jobs. They were acting suspicious." Mitchell, sitting on the couch, sighed heavily. She no longer had the energy to argue. "We crossed a line, Dave. You know it. We didn't even bother to check who they were before we made assumptions. This isn't going to end well for us." Fisher scoffed, unwilling to accept the reality. But deep down, even he knew she was right. Weeks later, the results of the internal affairs investigation were released. Both Fisher and Mitchell were found guilty of misconduct, racial profiling, and the unlawful arrest of federal agents. The department, facing immense public pressure, had no choice but to fire them. But the consequences didn't stop there. The FBI, working in conjunction with the Department of Justice, filed civil rights violation charges against the two former officers, opening the door to potential federal prosecution. As the legal proceedings began, Fisher and Mitchell were forced to reckon with the full scope of their actions. The case drew widespread attention, with the trial becoming a flashpoint in the national conversation about race and policing. Civil rights activists, legal experts, and the media scrutinized every detail, and the pressure on the justice system to deliver a fair outcome was immense. During the trial, Carter and Walker took the stand, recounting the events of that day with a calm professionalism that belied the intensity of their emotions. They spoke not just about their personal experience, but about the broader implications of what had happened. "This wasn't just about two officers making a bad judgment call," Carter testified. "This is about a system that allows bias to go unchecked. My partner and I were fortunate. We're FBI agents. We had the resources and the authority to push back. But what happens to the countless others who don't? How many more innocent people are treated like criminals because of the color of their skin?" Walker echoed his partner's sentiments, adding, "We're here today not just to seek justice for ourselves, but to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The prosecution laid out a meticulous case, supported by body cam footage and the damning record of past complaints against the officers. Fisher and Mitchell's defense attempted to argue that they had acted in good faith, citing their years of service, but it wasn't enough to sway the jury. In the end, the verdict was clear. Fisher and Mitchell were convicted of civil rights violations, and though they avoided lengthy prison sentences, their careers and reputations were forever tarnished. The ruling sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, a stark reminder that no one, no matter how protected they might feel behind their badge, was above accountability. Months later, Carter and Walker continued their work at the FBI, knowing that they had made a real difference, not just in their own lives, but in the broader fight for justice. The case had sparked widespread reform efforts within the Chicago PD, including mandatory anti-bias training and a renewed focus on community policing. While systemic change was slow and difficult, the incident had proven that progress was possible. For Fisher and Mitchell, the story ended in disgrace. They had once believed themselves untouchable, but they had learned the hard way that in a world increasingly unwilling to tolerate injustice, no one was beyond reach.